Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and Happy New Year to everyone. Hope you all had a restful and great holiday. This is Jen Reed with the Science Collaborative, and I'm joined today by Megan Brass, Lynn Vaccaro, and Nick Soberall with our Science Collaborative team here in Ann Arbor. We also anticipate that members of the Centralized Data Management Office will be on the webinar with us. And also our NOAA Program Officer, Doug George, is attending. Although, sorry, Doug, I don't think we've allowed you the ability to turn on your camera, but just know he's listening. So a couple of notes here. We're recording the webinar, and we'll be posting a copy of the slides that we're using today and the recording to the Science Transfer Funding Opportunity page on our website. So this is the Science Transfer RFP Q&A webinar, just to make that official. And we're going to add answers to all the questions that we received today to the running Q&A document for the RFP that's also on the Science Transfer Funding page. As you heard when we started, all of our attendees here today are in listen-only mode. That really helps us ensure good sound quality as we go through a few slides that provide an overview of the RFP opportunity. If you have questions at any time, use the question function in your GoToWebinar console to ask your questions. And the bulk of time today, we intend to open up sound, open up the opportunity for you to ask questions as we wrap up. So what we'll do is go through some slides, answer any questions that we received through the console, and then allow the opportunity to ask any questions you might have verbally. Before we get started, we want to get a sense of who we have with us today. So we have a couple of quick polls. The first one, which has just been launched here, is about your experience with the proposal response at any point with the Science Collaborative RFP in the past. If anyone's had that experience, we'll give you a minute to respond. And it looks like we have a nice split here. We have some new folks, so welcome to those who've not yet submitted to the Science Transfer Opportunity, and welcome back to some veterans. Our next poll, if you want to throw that up there, Nick, is related to your interest. So for some of the new folks, you may or may not have any ideas and you're getting up to speed, or you might have some project ideas that you are thinking about pursuing. So we encourage you just to give us a sense of where you are with the RFP right now. Okay, well, this looks really interesting too. About half of you have a few potential project ideas. It's always good to have a few things in the back of your mind. A few of you are just getting up to speed in the RFP. So again, welcome to the new folks. And then it's good to see that there's a good portion of you, 40% or so, who are definitely submitting a proposal. We're really looking forward to seeing those proposals. So let's talk a little bit about where we're going today. Let's see, we're going to be walking through a summary of the grant opportunity. I'm going to say a little bit about timeline and some key requirements and review criteria. And then you'll also hear some examples of specific science transfer projects to give you kind of a feel for the kinds of things we've supported in the past. But we're planning to save about the last 30 minutes or so for your questions and to address those. And so at any point, please put your questions in the GoToWebinar console. So looking ahead at the Science Transfer Grant Opportunity, here's the timeline. So just quickly about what the specifications are for this opportunity. These grants are meant to promote the transfer of science and its use and application The projects can last up to 2 years, so up to 24 months, and awards can be up to $100,000 over those 24 months. We're really interested, though, in funding a variety of projects with the range of scopes and budget. And so we want you to understand and be very clear that we're welcoming proposals with budgets that are well below that 100K. They will be competitive. Basically, our review panel will be looking for scopes of work and budgets that match each other. Timeline-wise, there's a few key dates here to keep in mind. The proposals are due by 11:59 p.m. on February 25th. We have an online submission system, which you should have seen if you've already been exploring our website. If you haven't, go there and check that out. And we do encourage you to start that submission process as soon as possible in case you have any issues of connecting or have any questions that you need to that come up. You can address them before 10 o'clock that night, the due date. Our goal is to notify a successful, well, actually all applicants about funding decisions by the end of June, early July. So there's a bit of time span in there between when proposals are due and notification, but we have a robust review process we go through. All projects should have a start date of September 1st, 2021. So a couple things here about this opportunity, what the projects are, and in a sense what they aren't. But really to make clear what this grant program is all about. So we're looking for science transfer that can leverage existing research, whether that research has been generated with science collaborative funding or some other sort of funding within the system, or even resources that have been leveraged external to the system. But the idea is to leverage existing knowledge, science, research, and put it to work for the benefit of coastal communities and ecosystems. It's transferring that can incorporate sort of a range of collaborations and information sharing. It can be between programs within a single reserve, so maybe from the research program to education or to stewardship. It can be a transfer that occurs among 2 or more reserves, or it can be a transfer from the reserve to an external partner, a key external partner. It's also important to note that while science transfer can support data analysis and the development of new decision support tools, these grants are not intended to support new data collection. So it's not meant for you to go out and collect data that you then transfer, but to work with a body of data that have already been collected, interpreted, and to transfer that. There are a few cases where some limited data collection that's directly tied to the transfer activity itself and can be appropriate. Examples of that might be a needs assessment, user experience study, some other kind of evaluation of a tool or product. There may be field or social science data that needs to be collected in order to support a training activity related to that science transfer, or to calibrate a specific tool that's being transferred, but not to develop the tool itself. The RFP provides some additional guidance related to that, or we could take questions later on if there's any sort of questions of clarification necessary related to that aspect of the program. So this next slide here really, I think, illustrates nicely how the science transfer can occur. They're really intended, this opportunity, to build stronger and more connected network within the NERRS system. So these projects are to support the system, to support individual reserves or groups of reserves. And you can see how this particular opportunity that we're drawing from here is related to lessons that have been transferred related to climate resilience across the system, and you can see how it goes from coast to coast and from reserve to reserve, and sort of helps build that network. And this is that kind of connectivity that we're hoping to support through this grant program. So now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Nick, who's going to give some key elements of the RFP and walk us through that. So Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so as Jen said, I'm going to give just an overview of the 3 required elements for the science transfer proposals, and then at the end I'll wrap with the evaluation criteria and that whole process, and we'll just give an overview of that as well. So off the bat, the 3 things that all these science transfer proposals have to include are they have to relate to a science collaborative focus area, which are now on the slide. They have to engage at least one reserve directly, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment as well. And they have to identify the end users and include at least 1 letter of support. So for this first requirement, all these science transfer proposals, they have to relate to at least one of these focus areas that are both on the slide and also on the website. These focus areas are identified by NOAA, and they're identified for the program for several years at a time. So there's a lot of projects that can fit under these broad themes, and proposals should specify the connection in the proposal. Next, so the second part is the reserve engagement. So each of these projects that are funded through the Science Collaborative have to involve at least 1 reserve. And that means the proposed work must plan to actively engage the relevant staff from the reserve system, and the managers of all the reserves involved in the proposal have to be supportive of the proposed project. So how that works, and it's a bit different from previous years, is that after the proposals are submitted, we'll reach out to reserve managers directly and confirm that they're aware of and supportive of the proposals that name their reserve as a partner. If they have any concerns with either the engagement to date or the proposed role for their staff, they can complete a proposal assessment form to explain those concerns to us. And these forms are submitted directly to us from the managers, so it's not something the applicants need to worry about, but it is your responsibility to engage the relevant managers early in the planning process and make sure that you provide them a copy of the final proposal that you submitted. Even in cases where a science transfer project will be led by reserve staff and will benefit users and programs within the reserve system, applicants should still clearly explain how specific programs will benefit from the project and how individuals will collaborate to ensure that this project is successful. Okay, so the next part I should say, collaboration and end user integration. So collaboration and end user integration are both critical components of all science collaborative projects. There's a longer definition of what end users are that's in the RFP, but for a science transfer effort, we hope it might help to think about end users as the intended users of the project activities and products. Our goal in emphasizing responsiveness to end users' needs is that it will help applicants be specific about who their end users are and how those individuals will use and benefit from the work. So a few tips on how to engage with end users and how to write about it in your proposal, I should say as well. So proposals have to include at least 1 and no more than 3 letters of support. So this is a bit different as well. More than one organization can sign a single letter of support if their views are similar, and we actually encourage that sort of thing. So at least 1, no more than 3. The letter and the proposal narrative should explain how the end user has been engaged with the development of the proposal, how they see themselves continuing to inform the project if funded, and how they anticipate using project outputs. So reviewers will be looking for personalized signed letters on letterhead to confirm end user engagement and understand how the work will meet their needs. These are smaller grants, so we encourage you to be targeted and efficient in your approach. Focus on a couple primary end users. That's one way to go about it. And when you're identifying end users, we encourage you to be as specific as you can. So don't use terms like educators when you can use terms like education coordinators at 3 reserves, middle school science teachers in X state. It's appropriate to think of the reserves as one of your users, but they may not be the project's primary end user. So those are the 3 key components. So now we'll take a quick look at the proposal evaluation criteria and the review process. So all the proposals that come in will be reviewed by a multidisciplinary panel composed of collaboration, communications, and outreach experts that have some experience with coastal science and management. Panelists will complete a written review of proposals and then come together to discuss and rank order the proposals based on the recommendations for funding. And applicants receive a copy of the written reviews as well as a summary of the panel discussion. And the panel discussion summary should help resolve any major differences in the reviews and also have some constructive feedback for the team. For evaluation criteria, they are currently listed on the slide. So proposals are evaluated based on these 5 topics. For each topic, there are 1 to 4 specific evaluation questions, and reviewers have to provide a score for each question. So reviewers, for example, will be asked to respond to 4 questions about a project's feasibility, which you can see here. There's 4 questions for feasibility, 3 for approach, 2 for response to end user needs, etc. And it might be helpful to note that the exact language of each evaluation question is included in the RFP, so you have an idea of what they'll be responding to. It might be helpful as well that we equally weight each of the 13 questions when developing a summary score. So that means the topics of more evaluation questions like feasibility play a bigger role in determining a proposal's overall score. And the whole process is outlined in the RFP, but you can feel free to ask us more questions if you have them. And I believe now I'm passing it to Lynn for some project examples.
All right, thank you, Nick. And so I'm going to share 2 project examples with you. So this grant program that we've been talking about has supported a really wide range of projects. So it was really difficult to pick just 2 examples. There's projects that are maybe more on the technical side, doing targeted data synthesis exercises or things that are developing regional summits. So just kind of with that breadth in mind, these are just 2 examples. And we thought it'd be helpful to highlight here the transfer element that's involved in each of the projects and how the project defined their users. So those are 2 things that may seem just a little awkward when you first kind of get to know this program. So this first example here was a project that was led by an education coordinator from Wells Reserve in Maine. And they used their grant funds to work with the 4 New England reserves to develop lessons and lead teacher training workshops about climate change impacts for their local coastal habitats. For example, you can see in the photos there that they developed some really neat classroom materials that helped illustrate the way the reserves do surface elevation table data collection, which was a fairly new component to the reserve monitoring program when this project first began. So as with many projects, there's different types of information transfer that are happening as part of these projects. So in this case here, the project fostered a really nice collaboration between programs at a single reserve. So for example, the research and stewardship programs provided a lot of the data and some of the sort of initial kind of monitoring examples that were then used in the educational materials that the team developed in their curriculum and their training workshops. And then, of course, they also had the goal of, benefiting ultimately, right, the middle and high school science teachers and their students with those materials. So you could kind of think of it as a couple different tiers of users that were involved in this project. And then there was also really nice collaboration happening across the New England reserves that really pooled their resources to develop this compiled, comprehensive curriculum around these important climate change topics. So the next example here was led by the manager from Great Bay Reserve, Roca Communications, and a researcher from the University of New Hampshire. And you can see along the bottom there how the transfer of information happened in this project. They took a tool that had been used in a different region, in this case Chesapeake Bay, and then really customized it and applied it to benefit the users in that region. So in this case, the project's users were water quality regulators, towns around Great Bay Reserve that were complying with MS4 permits, and the consultants that then served those towns. And in this case, the project developed and facilitated a very structured expert panel process that developed guidance on calculating pollutant removal rates for buffers, with the ultimate goal that the projects would then, the ultimate goal that the towns would be incentivized to do more buffer restoration and protection because they could potentially get regulatory credit for those actions. In terms of products in this case, they developed a technical summary of the recommendations that came out of the expert panel process. And they also summarized the process that they used so that others could take that same expert panel process and apply it to other topics. And similar to the last project, actually this was a multi-reserve project where they shared their findings and conducted workshops at the end of the project in 2 other states nearby. So again, multiple types of transfer happening here and different types of users involved. And I guess I'll just note, because one thing that I noticed about these 2 examples we picked out, they both happen to be multi-reserve examples. There's no requirement that science transfer projects have to involve multiple reserves. Both single reserve and multi-reserve projects are fully eligible in this program. Hopefully those 2 snapshots can help bring home what we mean by science transfer and how end users can be, defined and identified in your proposals. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Megan, who's going to offer just a few more tips on developing really strong competitive proposals.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, so I'm going to just close out our little presentation portion of this webinar today with some tips that we put together for developing competitive proposals. These are actually tips we share with all applicants to our programs because these elements are really critical for all science collaborative proposals if you want to be competitive. So what you see on the slide is a set of tips. They're organized by what we ask for in your proposals. So kind of helping you step through the proposal itself and think about those key elements and how to put them together. So the first one, when you're writing about your objective and your end user need, we really encourage you to make an effort to keep it simple, clear, and focused. Find an organized way to identify the primary end users and state their connection to the focal issue. And be specific about how that user will benefit from the project. As you're laying out the outputs and outcomes, we really encourage you to just pause and make sure you have a clear sense of what we mean by outputs and outcomes and make an effort not to mix them up. Outputs are those specific products or events that you can point to that will be happening in the project or produced through the project. And then outcomes are really those bigger impacts that you're trying to achieve. We also encourage you to connect the dots between those important elements. It's not just stating them, but talk about how the need of your primary end user is being addressed, how those project outputs will benefit the users and how use of those outputs will lead to those desired outcomes. Don't assume that reviewers are going to understand something that's only implied or vague or loosely connected, and that's relevant throughout the whole proposal narrative. As you're beginning to outline your project approach, we really encourage you to be specific about your technical methods and the approach for fostering good communication and collaboration with your team. And when possible, make an effort to explain why you've chosen a particular approach. So for example, why are focus groups needed? Or how do you know that an existing group can provide sufficient end user input for your project? Help the reviewer really understand your rationale for your approach, and this will be a lot more convincing to them as they're reviewing your proposal and convincing them that you'll be able to achieve your objective with those methods. The team section is really your place to explain why your team is well qualified to complete the work. So you'll need to specify the roles and take a moment to customize those CVs to help demonstrate that the team members that you've identified for the work have the right background to complete the work. And then last but not least, pay attention to the overall proposal presentation. Sometimes things happen at the last minute, but just want to encourage you to kind of just step back and review it one last time to make sure you're adhering to all of the RFP guidelines. We do provide formatting guidelines. And just know that, if there's sloppy formatting or a lot of grammatical mistakes, it doesn't review quite as well, even if the ideas are compelling. So that kind of sums up our tips. The last slide we wanted to share with you all is just a reminder of the program resources and support that are available to applicants. So on our website, you can see examples of prior science transfer projects in our project catalog. Just filter for science transfer projects. You can check out the archive of webinars from our Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. There are several science transfer projects that have been featured there, and taking a look at prior examples helps you understand, what's been successful in the past, and might help give you ideas about how to articulate what you're trying to achieve and why it meets the RFP objectives. Also, take a look at the funding opportunity page. There are links to other applicant resources like a more extensive proposal tips tool, tools for characterizing your end users and identifying end users. And then, of course, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with questions. The best way to get a hold of us is sending a quick note to that NERRS info account, and 3 of us monitor that, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And if you'd like to chat, we're happy to give you a call or schedule a time to chat to talk through questions or challenges you might be facing. And with that, I think we're ready for the Q&A session, and I'll hand it back to Jen to help lead us through that.
Great. Well, thank you, Megan and Lynn and Nick, for sharing all information about the RFP process. And welcome back, everybody. So just wanted to throw this open now. Are there any questions in the chat that we've received so far? So we haven't received anything. I then encourage folks, can we unmute? Looking. If we can unmute, we can have folks speak up. Oh, we got a question here.
2 just came in. Yeah, a couple questions.
Okay.
But we can also, as Jen said, we can unmute people if you prefer to verbalize yourself.
All right, so it looks like we have a question about flexibility in project start date. Generally, we don't offer a ton of flexibility. Of course, this past year has been the exception to that rule because of just all the challenges of COVID, but we'll be looking for projects that start around September 1st. They won't be able to start much before September 1st. You might be able to delay by a month or so if you had a compelling reason for your project to start later. But I would encourage you, if you have some specific case in mind, to connect with us through NERRS info and we can talk through that. But generally, we want to see those projects starting September 1. And we have a question about developing budgets. That's a great question because I think that's something that can trip a lot of projects up. Generally, what sort of our experience is sort of sit down and figure out what is it that you want to do and what will it take to do that. That's very basic, but how many people, how much time, and make sure that what you're planning to do, you have the time and the people effort to actually make that happen. So you don't want to propose to do a whole bunch of things that you don't have the budget bandwidth to do. So I was trying to do that fairly early on. Like, I know what we kind of have in mind is going to take about this much. And then through the iteration of the project, scope of work, who's involved, etc., you can also refine your budget. But I start usually with something pretty broad and pretty raw, to be honest, and sort of work backward from there. But starting early is really important, so you're not having to make last-minute changes that leave you kind of hanging and disrupt your idea. Let's see.
Jen, maybe I'll just add one thing to that. We do
that
provide
would be great.
a budget template too to help organize your, all of your expenses. And if there's any questions about the template, and if anything's not clear, please do reach out. We tend to get a lot of questions about just making sure people are clear about what we're asking for in that template.
That's a good point, Megan. And that template allows you to sort of group your expenses into, things like salary, travel, equipment purchase, those kinds of things. So we have another question. If a project has been transferred through a previous science transfer grant in the past, is it eligible to be funded again with a transfer to a different reserve? And would this hurt chances of award? So we have had that question previously, and I'm going to look to Megan and Lynn to remind me, but I think we agreed that you could not do the exact same project again, so you couldn't transfer the project to the same reserve that had already been funded. However, transferring that body of knowledge to a different reserve would qualify and would not be penalized in any way. That project proposal would be weighed against all the other projects proposals that we have in this current competition. Am I recalling that correctly, Lynn?
Yeah, exactly. And I think with kind of the sort of tip that, yeah, I mean, when you're transferring to a new region, there may need to be some customization and some, you know, some work to tailor it for unique needs. And that might be something to really point out to as you try to demonstrate the value of this transfer effort you're doing, to make sure that there is a novel component in there that's explained in your proposal.
I think also leveraging what was learned through the prior one about how to maybe do it better is another thing that we would expect to see.
Yeah, both excellent points. Let's see, there is a question, another budget question. Are matching funds required? And the answer to that is no. We're in a really fortunate situation where you do not require to have matching funds for this competition. Okay, another question here. Can you describe if there's a timeline for selecting contractual personnel and efforts that you would put out to bid as part of a grant proposal? And if there is any expectation tied to that, to awarding funding for subcontracts. So I think this refers to situations where you may know you have some work that needs to be done, but you haven't identified who's going to do it at the time of submitting the proposal. And so you say you're going to have you'll have a bid for that work. And you may be in a situation in a state agency or something where you're required to do that because of agency regulations. So there's not a requirement on our part for when that needs to happen. We would if you were selected for support, we'd write a contract, even if you hadn't yet selected that subcontractor. However, your budget can't change, and so would be an onus on you for both being a good sort of project and proposal manager to really have a strong sense of what that is likely to be, not guess, but sort of have in your back of your mind, maybe even demonstrating in your proposal some way you know that what you've budgeted for that contractual amount is feasible and is likely to be within, a percentage or two of what you've got. And sort of being able to demonstrate that would be helpful too. Not required, but the reviewers are going to be looking at feasibility, and that is matching budget to scope of work, and the reviewers have a strong sense of what it takes to get work done. So they're going to be looking at that pretty closely themselves. I saw Megan and Lynn nodding, but I wonder if you have anything else you care to add to that.
I was just going to note that the RFP under the budget narrative, there's a section like sub 7 that has a little paragraph, a little blurb about how to handle the bid projects or work that requires a bid. So it's essentially what Jen just said, but if you want to reference, it's also there.
I would just add too to be explicit about it if you're planning to use a contract to get some of the work done. The reviewers may look to your team And if they see that there's a gap in expertise, they're going to sort of wonder how you're going to fill that gap. And so just make it clear, both in the proposal narrative as well as in the budget, which elements you're planning to kind of hire out for and how you're planning to make sure that you've got the capacity to get the project done.
Yeah, good advice. Okay, here's another good question. So would the transfer of a set of facilitation techniques that help collaborative science get done be eligible, since we're not technically transferring science per se? That's a great question. I want to say yes, but I also feel like I want to have a conversation with Doug and make sure that we're not inadvertently expanding the intention of this opportunity. So I see who sent this to us, and I will respond directly to you, but also make sure that the Q&A document is updated with the response when we have that. These have been some great questions, and as a quick reminder, we'll be posting the recording and posting our responses to these questions to the RFP website. So you have a chance to go back and catch them if you don't get everything, either when we say it or you have to leave. Okay, another great question. Does there need to be an identified secondary end user, or is identification of reserve staff as primary end users sufficient? I am going to ask for Lynn's opinion on this. I think the answer is a primary end user is sufficient, especially if it's the reserve, particularly your ability to demonstrate that the reserve is going to benefit. But I know we were talking about this the other day, and so I want to know what your perspective is too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the RFP as written, makes that type of activity fully eligible. I think it's just, just explaining how the work is going to benefit the reserve system, how that work will be used. And then, of course, just making sure that you've got the full support of the reserve manager. There's a planned collaboration with reserve staff during the project, meets the rest of the criteria around reserve engagement. Yeah, but no, I think having the reserve system as a designated end user for your project is perfectly appropriate for this RFP.
So we've slowed down on questions, as you may have gathered. Oh, that's all I have to do is say something and we get a question. So another great question, should an assessment and evaluation plan be included in the proposal? So an assessment if necessary. There might already be an assessment that you can draw upon and demonstrate that what you're doing is meeting that need. An evaluation plan, so evaluating the success of the work, is not a requirement of this RFP opportunity, but definitely I think would strengthen a proposal. That's sort of my quick take on those two things. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to offer there. Well, folks, I think it's been 5 minutes. We haven't really heard anything further. We appreciate those of you who've stuck around, but I think what we're going to do now is say thank you for your time and attention and your interest in this opportunity. We're really looking forward to seeing those proposals when they come in here in a month and a half or so, and encourage you to reach out with any questions you have to our team. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.